Usability testing, considering the dyslexic user. Laura Huizinga, Fall 2014. As HCI students, many of us are familiar with usability testing. You may also be familiar with accessibility issues, but you may not have considered what happens when a user is dyslexic. First off, what is dyslexia? Dyslexia is a specific learning disorder that affects reading and the processing of words. It affects as many as 1 in 5 individuals, and its severity falls on a spectrum. While some may read slowly with great concentration, others may struggle to decode even one-syllable words. This, however, is not a sign of low intelligence. In fact, dyslexia is characterized by average to above average intelligence. Many dyslexics can benefit greatly from the use of devices such as tablets, smartphones, and computers. "20% of the U.S. population struggles with some form of dyslexia, and dyslexics tend to rely heavily on devices to aid or cope with the areas they struggle with. This means that a large and significant portion of users of these devices are dyslexic. Unfortunately, as designers and developers, we do not always consider the dyslexic user. I will be talking about usability considerations specifically for dyslexic users. When dyslexic users are taken into consideration, the benefits translate to all users, including the 20% of dyslexic individuals. According to Rello, Kandavi, and Batsy Yates, dyslexia and accessibility studies compared to other groups of users with special needs, studies about dyslexia and web accessibility are scarce. In the current recommendations for accessible web, dyslexia is only one more disability within a diverse group of cognitive disabilities. However, there are considerable barriers for dyslexics when using the web. When considering accessibility, we often look to the WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Unfortunately, they do not provide any specific guidelines for dyslexic users, so we were forced to look elsewhere. The International Dyslexia Association has a list of helpful guidelines. The British Dyslexia Association has also compiled a style guide. Today we will be looking at 6 tips to help dyslexic users from the UX Movement website that are based on these guidelines. Anthony has compiled 6 major pitfalls to watch out for that are likely to cause visual distortion that affects dyslexic users. These issues can lower readability for all users, but particularly for dyslexics. River effects happen when gaps are created in the text that result in strings of white space. Rivers reduce readability for everyone, but it is exaggerated in dyslexic users. Some areas to watch out for rivers. Justified text. When justified text is used, it creates space between the letters and words. These spaces can line up on one another and create distracting areas of white space. This can cause a dyslexic reader to repeatedly lose their place when reading. You can avoid rivers by using left-aligned text instead of justified. Remember not to use double spaces after periods. Most of us have a habit of using double spaces, but when using a word-operated program, we no longer need to use 2 spaces. It creates extra space that can cause additional issues for a dyslexic when reading. The blur effect. It's another kind of visual distortion effect that can occur among dyslexic users. This can significantly affect a dyslexic user's reading ability and makes reading very tiring. You can lessen this effect by avoiding some bad practices. Remember not to use pure black text on a pure white background. The high contrast creates a sensitivity to the brightness. This can cause words to swirl or blur together. To avoid this, use an off-white color for your background, such as light gray or tan. You can also use a dark gray text instead of pure black to cut the glare even more. Reduce long blocks of unbroken paragraphs. Long blocks of unbroken paragraphs are not only hard for dyslexic users, but for non-dyslexic users as well. It's easier for people to lose their place in a long paragraph, which is why it's better to use short paragraphs that express one idea. Washout effect. When this happens, text looks faint or indistinct. This can make reading slower and cause users to guess a word because it's difficult to see. Try to avoid using serif fonts. Since the serifs at the end of the letter can cause words to blur together and making the letters run together. By choosing a sans serif font, dyslexic users are able to see the shapes of letters clearer. Also avoid using italic fonts. Italics are sometimes used to highlight, but you should be careful about how much you use them. The jagged lines and slants decrease readability. In addition to making design decisions to improve readability for all users, including dyslexics, some steps while testing should be taken. Using a think aloud protocol is helpful with any user, but could be particularly important for dyslexic users. Having each task read out loud to the user before the user begins the task will help clarify the task for the user. If the user has a hard time reading the task or misreads the task, the test could show issues with the product that are not really there. Often we conduct exit surveys that are multiple choice questions on a Likert scale. The questions are often worded in ways to make sure users are paying attention to the questions and not answering just all the same number. This flip-flopping of how questions are asked can be particularly confusing for dyslexic users. By keeping the exit survey short and conducting it orally, more accurate answers can be gathered. Much more research is needed to define usability testing standards for dyslexic users. That concludes my presentation, and here is a list of my resources.